Thank you so much. I am the Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, as you may have heard, and you may be thinking, we need a committee to protect journalists. It is pretty crazy that in this day and age, not only are journalists under threat around the world, but we need an entire committee that is dedicated to keeping them safe. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is today in the age of information warfare. When Patricia Melo Campo reported from hotspots in conflict zones as diverse as Iraq and Sudan, she knew that she had to wear personal protective gear, she had to keep herself safe, she had to have a security protocol, do risk assessments, but she never needed a bodyguard until she was reporting in Brazil, her home country, on presidential elections there. She was the target of relentless attacks online, a relentless trolling campaign following her reporting on then candidate, Jair Bolsonaro. This online smear campaign that Bolsonaro helped propel with derogatory social media posts, doctored photos of the striking journalist shared on Facebook, led to threats that made her fear for her safety. His supporters and people online would organize in WhatsApp groups and in secret groups and threaten her, and then show up when she was supposed to be somewhere doing an event and threaten her. So she had real reason to feel concerned, because the people who harassed her online would show up in the real world. So there is no differentiation between the virtual world and the real world. That is very, early 2000s. Patricia told me when she was in New York in November to get the International Press Freedom Award from the Committee to Protect Journalists, she told me each time he would tweet me, the trolls would come. Last week during a congressional hearing on fake news, she was accused of selling sex for information. That accusation was then repeated publicly, including by President Bolsonaro's son, who is also a congressman. And guess what happened? A massive trolling campaign that has once again put her in the crosshairs, threatening and undermining her work. These virtual lynchings, as Patricia calls them, the self-censorship that results from coordinated online attacks against journalists, can have a ripple effect that negatively impacts journalism, but also the ability to hold public officials accountable and inform the public. Unfortunately for journalists, the use of targeted online hate and harassment campaigns to intimidate and silence them, especially journalists critical of the state, is becoming increasingly popular and is one of the primary tactics of the information warfare playbook. This playbook has emerged amid a global pushback, amid the lessons that were learned from the Arab Spring, the color revolutions, and the rise of populist demagogic leaders around the world and authoritarians alike. When governments saw the way that young people were using social media to mobilize and inspire people to influence the global media agenda, they didn't think, oh, this is great. They thought, hey, we need to get on these platforms. We need to manage them. We need to control them. We need to fight back against these reformers, these journalists, these truth tellers. So around the world now, authoritarian governments and democratic governments alike are using the very same technologies that had liberated information to control and suppress independent reporting. The strategy of attacking critics while undermining, drowning out, and delegitimizing independent reporting has massive implications and is now at the heart of the information warfare playbook. In Malta, investigative journalist and blogger Daphne Caruana Galizia was vilified in a campaign of both online and offline harassment in the months leading up to her assassination in 2017. Pro-government Facebook groups, secret Facebook groups, would organize what the meme of the day was going to be. What was the main message going to be to undermine this investigative reporter who was reporting on corruption by the government and ruling elites? and then they would spread this into the public sphere on social media. These Facebook groups were used to undermine not only Daphne, but the few other journalists trying to do critical reporting, spread junk news, and make it very difficult to find the real reporting. Daphne was murdered by a car bomb just outside of her home in an attack that officials, some of whom were part of those Facebook groups, were implicated in. This is a photo of the memorial that we set up in Valletta on the 1-year anniversary of her murder, the one that they kept taking down because they refused to even let us put up flowers in her name, because not only are they trying to erase her journalism online, but trying to erase her memory. How do reporters know when online threats are going to lead to mortal attacks? In India, investigative journalist Rana Ayub wrote a book examining the role of government officials in deadly sectarian riots in Gujarat during the tenure of Narendra Modi there, who was the chief minister at the time. And in 2018, pro-Modi social media accounts circulated memes about her, and including a video, what we would call a deep fake, of her face put onto a pornographic video, circulated that online, and led to a vitriolic campaign of harassment and hate. She got so concerned for her safety that she had to leave the country. And thankfully, the Committee to Protect Journalists was able to help her get out of the country for a few months to avoid those death threats and get out of harm's way. So we know that at the Committee to Protect, let me tell you another story about India. So Rana was worried about India, and when do these online threats turn into mortal threats? She was worried, and she had good reason to be, because Gauri Lankesh, another journalist from India who published anti-extremist news and was critical of right-wing extremists, had translated Rana's book not long before she was assassinated. At the time of her assassination in 2017, she was also appealing a criminal defamation charge, the sentence that the ruling party's head of information technology had publicized on Twitter. Gauri's final editorial was titled, "In the Age of Fake News," and lamented how disinformation and propaganda on social media were poisoning the political environment. And sadly, this environment has only gotten worse, not only in India, but around the world. So at the Committee to Protect Journalists, we have been working since 1981 to protect journalists and their right to report the news safely and without fear of reprisal. We've been tracking cases of journalists who are murdered and imprisoned for their work, reporting, systematically documenting these attacks and daily threats. So we know that the contemporary environment, this threats to press freedom, free expression, and the free flow of information is unprecedented. While we saw a dramatic decline in the number of journalists killed and murdered for their work last year, we don't know yet if this was a blip or a trend. And in all other dimensions, the threats are mounting. The past 4 years have seen a record number of journalists imprisoned for their work, more than 250 each year. So the majority of journalists are jailed on anti-state charges like terrorism, also a gift of the United States, which after 9/11 used terrorism, and we've seen that all over the world being used as an excuse to jail journalists. But we've also seen the rise of false news charges. Now, false news is, ironically not very well defined, and you can see that there has been a significant increase in the number of journalists imprisoned on false news. Ironically, even world leaders who are using disinformation campaigns to target journalists are passing false news laws that are going to criminalize independent reporting or facts that aren't in line with the official perspective. And what do you think was the beat most likely to land a journalist in jail? You can yell it out. Any ideas? Corruption? Culture? Actually, it was politics. The most dangerous beat for journalists is politics. Censorship in the age of information warfare means targeting journalists who attempt to report on sensitive targets and drowning out legitimate journalism. Journalists reporting on politics, reporting on corruption and crime are increasingly finding themselves in the crosshairs of state-sponsored trolling campaigns, disinformation campaigns. We call this online harassment, but that barely conveys what they go through. And oftentimes they're helped by PR firms or volunteer recruits. And if you dare to report on those information operations, watch out. You will likely be next. You'll hear from our next speaker, Maria Ressa, about what happened to her after she reported on Duterte's disinformation campaigns in 2016. And if we had only been reading those reports, we would have known what was coming in our own elections. A multi-million-dollar industry devoted to running influence operations and information warfare has emerged, and it is increasingly marketing its propaganda and influence services to political parties and candidates. Facebook even had an embed program where it sent its operatives to embed with political campaigns, including Duterte in the Philippines, Modi in India, the nationalist President Andrzej Duda in Poland, the German nationalist AfD party, and the United States in President Trump's campaign in 2016. A global study found that at least 70 countries around the world are using social media manipulation campaigns to influence popular opinion, to influence the public. And in 45 of those countries, these are happening during elections. This means that they are using political bots to amplify hate speech, that they are manipulating content or getting legitimate content removed or drowning it out. They're illegally harvesting our data, micro-targeting us, mobilizing cyber troops to deter or bully journalists and political opponents in campaigns that are explicitly or implicitly sanctioned by the state. At the Committee to Protect Journalists, we developed a safety kit for reporters covering elections in Brazil and Guatemala and India, South Africa, and the United States. It includes not only the physical safety information that you need to cover elections safely, because when you get a lot of people together, it can be dangerous, but also increasingly digital safety, digital security. We are helping to give them the tools that they need to try to keep themselves safe and counteract the information warfare playbook. This might include things like securing your passwords, removing your personal information online, using encryption and secure communications. But they also need authorities and tech platforms to do their part, right? The intersection of disinformation campaigns and online harassment of journalists in the context of elections is one of the gravest threats to press freedom that we are currently dealing with. It's also a threat to democracy more broadly. When journalists are trying to fight back against these very well-funded, well-sponsored campaigns, what are they not doing? Well, they're not reporting. How can an individual journalist or news outlet possibly compete with government officials who can mobilize the resources of the state or their campaigns, who can fund counter-speech and alternative facts? How can journalists possibly expect to compete in gaming the social media algorithms and paying for that service at the expense of paying for news gathering? The asymmetry between the institutional resources of these leaders and a journalist or a media organization is vast, putting even more pressure on an industry that has already seen its revenue models devastated by the very platforms that are seeking to delegitimize them in the first place. And no, journalists cannot just get off of social media. They can't just opt out. Journalists need to go where the audience is. They use social media to find stories, to connect with sources, to do their reporting, and to, of course, engage with the audience. And if you're a journalist working for a news outlet, your editor expects you to be on social media, amplifying that reporting. And if you're a freelance journalist, you have to be on social media. That is the workplace of journalism. So this idea that you can opt out is just not realistic. The lack of trust in journalism, meanwhile, creates fertile conditions for attacks to succeed. While the algorithmic intermediations of news via a few dominant platforms renders journalism increasingly invisible to the average person. Furthermore, journalism is indistinguishable from other forms of communication online, from junk news, from propaganda, from entertainment. How do you know what you're seeing on YouTube or Facebook and Twitter? Which is where a significant percentage of the people around the world get their news. And a survey found that when you ask people where they got their news, they said something like Facebook, but that's like saying I got my news from the telephone, right? What about the byline? What about the institution where that news came from? So when governments launch propaganda campaigns and disinformation operations, they get amplified and regurgitated on social media, and they look just like news. And Russia has pioneered offensive information warfare, deploying disinformation campaigns to influence elections, to increase polarization and undermine press freedom and democracy at home and around the world. We have seen Russia use junk news and propaganda in the Baltic states, in Ukraine, where it planted stories of attacks on ethnic Russians that paved the way for the annexation of Crimea. And of course, we've seen it in the United States. Russia has a host of media organizations as well that are dedicated to disseminating propaganda, muddying the concept of truth, and perpetuating a certain worldview that is not hospitable to journalists and press freedom. They murder journalists in Russia, and the masterminds are not brought to justice. Its internet research agency reportedly employs hundreds of people and appears to operate a network of pro-Kremlin websites, including the Federal News Agency, and has a reported budget of what is the equivalent of $400,000 a month. That far exceeds the budget of most newsrooms, much less individual journalists. And it pays competitive salaries. How do you compete in this? Adrian Chen of the New York Times said that Russia has industrialized the art of trolling. But I would put it to you that while Russia may have industrialized the art of trolling, President Trump has elevated trolling to a tool of statecraft. His fake news rhetoric has his masterful use of Twitter, his manipulation of the mainstream media has really paid off. Distrust in the media is at record highs, and distrust is at record lows, his approval is at record highs. So Trump's constantly attacking the media, and we did a study of his Twitter account over a significant time period and found that 10% of his tweets were attacking or vilifying or targeting journalists or media outlets. And maybe you'll remember that in the beginning of his presidency, when he was chatting with Leslie Stahl before a 60 Minutes interview, he told her why he does this. He said, "I do it to discredit and demean you all, so that when you report something negative about me, no one will believe you." Trump's fake news rubric has provided a compelling rhetorical framework to justify repression around the world. Countries in every region are adopting false news laws. They are ostensibly aimed at staunching the flow of disinformation, which is a real problem, but in fact, they're actually being used to imprison journalists and restrict independent expression. So while the trend of imprisoning journalists on false news charges precedes Trump, we have seen that that number has risen significantly, and we see this in countries like Cameroon. This is not Cameroon. We'll go to that in a minute. So in Cameroon, journalist Paul Shuda is known for his coverage of political corruption. He operated a website, he had a Facebook news page called the TGV de l'Info, the TGV of Information, and he was jailed in May 2019 on accusations of criminal defamation and false news, following a defamation complaint. He is facing a prison sentence of 5 years in jail. the maximum sentence under Cameroon's criminal penal code that was updated in 2016 to include prohibitions against anyone publishing any news without being able to prove either its truth or that he had good reason to believe it to be true. Now, journalism is the first draft of history. We sometimes get things wrong, but when we get things wrong, we publish corrections. Of course, it's hard to append those corrections in the social media era. But this is what distinguishes journalism from other forms of communication, from other forms of information. And the irony. While governments can engage in disinformation and harassment campaigns, journalists who spread information deemed by authorities to be inaccurate face jail time, threats, and intimidation. The information revolution was supposed to free us from censorship. It was supposed to democratize information. But instead, we've turned these liberation technologies into weapons of subjugation. And China is leading the way, weaving a pervasive surveillance logic into daily life and the communications ecosystem. It offers what many countries increasingly see as a great alternative to the Western model or the democratic model. China controls the flow of information through the Great Firewall and ubiquitous censorship, and deploys an army of paid commentators to root out critical commentary. And we saw this most recently in attempts by China to suppress news of the coronavirus. And maybe this delayed a response that would have prevented the rapid spread of the virus. It expelled 3 Wall Street Journal reporters from China when they wrote a critical article earlier in the week. And when these censorial measures fail, well, targeted retaliation is the next step. Several bloggers and activists who have criticized China's response have been detained or gone missing. Freelance journalist Che Shishi disappeared earlier this month after reporting that local hospitals, not surprisingly, were having a hard time dealing with the influx of patients. He's gone missing. He's likely in government custody, along with 48 other journalists who are behind bars in China for their reporting. China is the leading jailer of journalists, by the way. Most of those journalists in prison also were Uyghurs, and they are in prison because they were reporting on massive human rights violations in the contested region of Xinjiang. So when this coronavirus is spreading, and we have China putting people in jail for reporting on it. So as the coronavirus is spreading around the world, so is China's approach to controlling information and punishing the messenger. So in Malaysia, authorities have criminally charged a journalist who posted an alarmist message on Facebook. In Thailand, the Prime Minister threatened to arrest any journalist who published fake news about the virus. Iran arrested several social media users for spreading propaganda to scare public opinion before, guess what? Finally admitting this week that indeed it did have people with the virus inside its borders. And even in Nigeria, where there have been no reports of the virus, they arrested 5 television journalists and charged them with incitement. Outside of China, the demonization and intimidation of the media and journalists is facilitated by Western firms that sell sophisticated surveillance, offensive hacking and malware technologies to governments that deploy them against critical journalists. Technology sold by companies based in Western democracies, including NSO Group and Israel Hacking Team and others, and they have been implicated in the surveillance, attacks, and even the murder of journalists in every region of the world. Many have provided expertise, some to the Emirates, which is the country where I worked as a journalist and got kicked out of for writing an article about public safety. When I was there, they sent us a malware via the state-owned telecom that would install spyware on our BlackBerries. This was a while ago. We still had BlackBerries. But these Western firms are helping and even training governments to use this very sophisticated surveillance technology, and these governments are some of the most repressive, worst violators of press freedom in the world. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Emirates, Uganda, Pakistan, Egypt. I mean, I don't need to name all of the countries, but this boundless trade in surveillance technology and offensive technologies allows governments with worrying press freedom records to purchase advanced tools on the open market that put journalists and their sources' lives in danger. It contributes to a climate of fear that chills critical reporting, that provides fodder for governmental attempts to demonize the media. In Uganda, President Yoweri Museveni personally threatened that those who reported critically on his policies, and security forces have reportedly used intercepted communications to intimidate journalists working on sensitive stories. In Pakistan, the military appears to sanction attacks and threats on journalists who report on its own security forces, and it sends a signal that journalists are legitimate targets, like Ahmed Nourani, who investigates the military and was assaulted in a highly coordinated attack after he organized an interview with a source on a rarely used open phone line. Mexico has deployed sophisticated surveillance operations against several journalists and their families, including the widow of murdered journalist Javier Valdez, using Pegasus spyware sold by NSO Group that ostensibly is sold only to governments to fight terrorism and protect national security. And Saudi Arabia likely deployed this same technology against Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi immediately before his murder and dismemberment in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Also against the newspaper's owner, Jeff Bezos, in what appears to have been a blotched attempt at blackmail. So using these technologies to spy on and entrap journalists not only poses a direct threat to the individual, but it also underscores the need for governments to step in and put export restrictions on these technologies, to require human rights assessments be done. We were on the Hill actually earlier this week, or last Saturday, so earlier this week, we were on the Hill talking to policymakers about just that, urging the US Congress to put export restrictions. We were in the UK last year talking to that government about putting export restrictions on this technology, because journalists cannot do their work and stay safe and defend press freedom by themselves. They need our help. Do you look at the bylines of the articles that you read? Great, glad to hear some yes. Do you think about like what went into producing or writing a story? The hours of talking to sources, of cultivating that relationship, of scrolling through reams of data, the costs of hiring a fixer, buying that protective body gear, figuring out, how to create the new digital platform that will allow us to go through troves of data and figure out what is in the Panama Papers and how to do that securely across borders. This costs money. It costs money to report the news, and it costs money to do it safely. Do you pay for your news? And journalists need tech platforms to stop enabling online harassment, the campaigns and manipulation, figure out how to avoid creating algorithmic incentives that favor junk news and extremism and give journalism a fighting chance. Journalists need governments to stop attacking them and instead put in place laws and policies so that they have some capacity to do what they can do on their own, but it is not enough to ask journalists to do it by themselves. We hear talk about the democratization of information in the new media age. But democracy implies accountability. And at that moment, it is in short supply. Until journalists are free to do their work without violence, censorship, and intimidation, the true potential of the information revolution will not be realized. Thank you.